It started with a whisper inside Buckingham Palace. A whisper so subtle most dismissed it as nonsense. But by morning, that whisper had grown into something far louder. A question echoing through every gilded hallway, every private office, and every trembling heart within the royal family. Had King Charles really chosen Prince Edward to replace Prince Harry? Pause for a moment and think about that. The quietest, most overlooked royal, the man long mocked for being too dull, too invisible, too obedient, now standing on the edge of one of the most shocking royal reversals in modern history. A replacement for the rebel prince. A proposal so unthinkable it felt like fiction. Yet, those who were in the room swear it was real. King Charles made an offer that would change the balance of power forever. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because make no mistake, this wasn't just about duty. It was about redemption, control, and perhaps revenge. For years, the royal family had been haunted by the ghost of Harry's rebellion. The interviews, the accusations, the Netflix series that painted the institution as cold, calculated, and cruel. And now, in the twilight of his reign, King Charles faced a haunting question of his own. Who could fill the void left by his youngest son? Who could carry the weight of the crown's dignity without repeating its past mistakes? The answer, surprisingly, came from the one man no one expected to rise. Prince Edward, the man who'd stayed silent through scandal. The man who watched brothers fight, tabloids roar, and public trust collapse, and said nothing. Until now. But before we dive into what Charles offered him, and the shocking reason behind that decision, we need to go back. Back to the moment the cracks in the monarchy began to show. Because Edward's quiet ascent didn't happen overnight. It was the result of years of loyalty, quiet endurance, and choices made in the shadows. Choices that would soon define the future of the House of Windsor. The truth is, King Charles had been losing faith in Harry for a long time. Long before Megxit, long before the Oprah interview, there were signs. Late-night phone calls that ended in silence. A growing list of grievances. Rumors that courtiers whispered about. How Harry's defiance had bruised the king's pride far deeper than anyone realized. And through it all, Edward watched. Calm. Stoic. A man who understood what silence could accomplish when words only made things worse. While Harry rebelled against the system, Edward learned to navigate within it. And that, right there, is the irony no one wants to talk about. In the monarchy, rebellion makes headlines, but obedience builds empires. Edward knew that, and Charles never forgot it. Now, let's be clear. This isn't some sentimental story about the good brother swooping in to save the crown. No, this was strategy. Cold, deliberate, royal strategy. King Charles understood something critical. The monarchy couldn't survive another scandal. He needed a stabilizer. A man who could repair the image Harry had shattered. Someone who embodied reliability, not rebellion. And who better than the one royal who'd never demanded attention, never courted chaos, and never tried to steal the spotlight. But here's where things get complicated, because accepting this role wasn't as simple as saying yes. Edward had seen what royal duty had done to his siblings. He'd watched his sister, Princess Anne, sacrifice privacy for purpose. He'd watched Andrew implode under scandal. And he'd watched Charles himself wrestle with guilt, public perception, and decades of controversy. So when the king finally turned to him with an offer that would change everything, Edward didn't rush to accept. He paused. He hesitated. Because he knew, behind that polite offer lay a trap. Let's rewind to how the offer came to be. It wasn't a grand announcement. No crown, no ceremony, no cheering crowds. Just a letter, delivered in person by a senior aide. Sealed in deep red wax, marked private. Edward opened it slowly, expecting perhaps a request for advice or an update on official engagements. Instead, what he read left him stunned. Charles wanted him to take on a new role, one designed to strengthen the continuity of the crown and restore public confidence in the institution. Those were the official words. But everyone in the family knew what they really meant. Step into the space Harry abandoned. Imagine that for a moment. Being asked to replace your own nephew, not in name, but in purpose. To become the son the king could count on when his own had turned away. It wasn't about titles or power, it was about legacy. Charles's health had been a growing concern. Whispered about by aides, speculated on by the media, quietly confirmed by insiders. There was a real sense that time was running out, and he needed to secure the monarchy's stability before it was too late. And in Edward, he saw something rare, a man who had nothing to prove, and therefore nothing to lose. But the public didn't know this yet. Not the secret dinners, not the letters, not the internal reports discussing Edward's growing role. They only saw a calm, aging monarch and his loyal younger brother standing side by side at recent events. No one realized those appearances were rehearsals, soft launches of a new royal partnership. Now ask yourself this: why Edward? Why not Prince William, the direct heir? Why not Princess Anne, the respected workhorse of the family? The answer lies in the one quality that made Edward different: neutrality. Edward wasn't seen as ambitious. He didn't have enemies in the press or within the palace. In a world of politics and ego, neutrality is power. Charles knew it, and so did those watching from the outside. But make no mistake, not everyone approved. Behind palace doors, tension brewed. Senior courtiers questioned the wisdom of giving Edward such a visible role. They worried it would signal a lack of faith in William or appear like a public rebuke of Harry. The monarchy thrives on unity, and this move threatened to expose old wounds. One insider reportedly described the mood in Clarence's house as tense enough to snap. And here's where the emotional undertones begin to surface. Edward, the quiet brother, now found himself at the center of a royal tug-of-war. For the first time in his life, his silence wasn't protection, it was power. And with power came scrutiny. Reporters began to notice his increasing visibility. Paparazzi who once ignored him suddenly followed his car. Public appearances once overlooked were now dissected frame by frame. But Edward wasn't playing the fame game. He wasn't there to steal attention. He was there to preserve the institution that had defined his life. For decades, he had watched his mother, the late Queen, endure scandal after scandal with grace and composure. He had learned from her that the true essence of royalty wasn't in words, it was in restraint. And now, that lesson would become his greatest weapon. Because what the public didn't realize, and what Charles didn't immediately reveal, was that this proposal wasn't just symbolic. It came with real authority. Edward was being groomed for something extraordinary, a future where he would represent the crown not as a placeholder, but as its moral anchor. Still, beneath the polished calm, Edward wrestled with his own doubts. He had no desire to overshadow William or erase Harry's legacy. But he also knew that turning down the king could be seen as disloyalty, and Edward's greatest fear was disappointing his family, especially his brother. The pressure built slowly. Weeks turned into months. Meetings were held in secret, involving palace advisors, communication chiefs, and legal experts. Every word, every detail, every photograph was analyzed for what it might suggest. And as the discussions deepened, Charles's language became more urgent. He wasn't merely asking anymore. He was preparing Edward for something inevitable. Edward, Charles reportedly said during one private conversation, "I need someone the country can trust." Those words echoed. They weren't flattery, they were confession. For the first time, the king acknowledged what many had whispered privately, that the royal family's image had fractured beyond recognition. That the damage done by Harry's departure wasn't just personal, it was institutional. And so, the stage was set. The crown, desperate for redemption. The king, anxious about legacy. The brother, torn between duty and hesitation. It was a perfect storm. But just as Edward began to consider saying yes, something unexpected happened. A development that turned this quiet, careful proposal into a full-blown crisis. Someone inside the palace found out. Someone who wasn't supposed to know. And within days, the whispers began again, louder, sharper, more dangerous this time. Because this time, they didn't ask if Charles had chosen Edward. They asked why. And that single question, why him and not Harry, would ignite a chain reaction that no one in the royal family could control. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It began with a letter, and an invitation too cryptic to ignore. Balmoral, September. Confidential. Prince Edward sat at his desk, reading the note again and again, unsure whether to be flattered or deeply alarmed. The king did not summon family members to Balmoral unless the matter was delicate or explosive. And lately, everything around King Charles seemed to hover somewhere between those two extremes. When Edward arrived, the castle felt heavier than usual. The Scottish air was crisp, but the atmosphere inside was thick with unspoken tension. A footman led him down the long corridor to the king's private study, the same room where, decades earlier, the late queen had made decisions that shaped history. Now it was Charles's turn, and his burden was visible in every line on his face. He greeted Edward not as a monarch greets a subject, but as a brother greets an equal. "We need to talk," Charles said simply. Those 4 words changed everything. Edward knew the tone. The king wasn't calling him here for casual family business. This was about something bigger, something dangerous. As the fire crackled, Charles poured them each a glass of whiskey. The silence stretched between them, long enough for Edward to sense the weight of what was coming. Then Charles spoke the words that would echo through the corridors of royal history. "Edward, I want you to take on what Harry abandoned." The words hit like a thunderclap. Edward froze. His mind spun. Take on what Harry abandoned? What exactly did that mean? Was this symbolic, political, or personal? Charles leaned forward. "The monarchy is bleeding credibility," he said quietly. "The public has lost faith. William cannot do it all alone. Not yet. I need someone who understands duty, without ego. Someone who can steady the ship." Edward's throat tightened. He'd spent his life serving quietly, content to stand in the background. He'd watched his brothers battle for attention, watched the media destroy reputations, and twist loyalty into scandal. But never, not once, had he imagined he'd be asked to step into Harry's place. Because that's what this was. Replacement. Succession insurance. A new royal bridge built over old family fractures. He took a slow breath. "You're asking me," he said carefully, "to become the son the world expected Harry to be." Charles didn't deny it. He didn't even look away. "Harry chose his path," the king replied. "But the monarchy must go on. You understand that better than anyone." For a long moment, Edward said nothing. The fire popped, the clock ticked, the world outside seemed to hold its breath. Finally, he asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "Why now?" Charles hesitated. His eyes, weary, almost pleading, gave the answer before his words did. "Because time isn't guaranteed," he said softly, "and the crown cannot wait for second chances." That's when Edward realized the truth no one dared to speak aloud. This wasn't just about Harry. This was about the king himself. His health, his fears, his legacy. Rumors had already been swirling for months. A series of postponed appearances. A sudden retreat to Sandringham for rest. The palace called it routine fatigue. Insiders knew better. Charles was planning ahead, not for the next event, but for the next era. And Edward was his chosen stabilizer. But even as the honor sank in, Edward's instincts screamed caution. Taking Harry's place meant inheriting more than responsibility. It meant inheriting controversy. The world would see it as a betrayal, a provocation, an open declaration that Harry had been erased from the royal equation. Was Edward ready to become the symbol of that? The conversation stretched into hours. They spoke of tradition, of family wounds, of how the monarchy needed healing optics. Charles envisioned Edward as the bridge, the figure who could quietly rebuild public faith through humility and duty. "The late queen saw that quality in you," Charles added. "She admired that you never chased the spotlight." Edward looked down at his hands. He remembered his mother's voice, steady, calm, instructive. "The work is what matters," she had once told him. Not the applause. She'd lived by that creed, and he'd built his life around it. Still, something inside him trembled. "If I do this," he said, "I do it for the institution, not for power, not for rivalry." Charles smiled faintly. "That's precisely why I chose you." But Edward wasn't ready to accept, not yet. Because beneath the royal formality lay a darker undercurrent. This proposal wasn't just a promotion. It was a test of loyalty, a test of unity, a test of whether the monarchy could survive without the son who'd walked away. What Charles didn't know was that Edward had his own condition, one that would soon ignite conflict behind palace doors. That night, Edward returned to his quarters at Balmoral and stared out into the dark highlands. The wind howled against the windows. He thought of Harry, the boy he'd once played with at Sandringham, the young man who'd laughed too loud, loved too hard, and fought too fiercely for independence. He wondered if Harry had ever truly understood what he'd left behind. Then he thought of the king, burdened, aging, haunted by the shadows of his own reign. And for the first time, Edward felt torn between two loyalties, to his brother and to his nephew. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, his decision began to take shape, not as a royal decree, but as a quiet vow. If he were to accept the king's offer, it would be on one condition. This move must bring peace, not division. It must mend the family, not fracture it further. But Charles didn't expect that condition. And when Edward finally voiced it, the king's reaction was anything but calm. The next day, they met again in the same study. Edward, resolute. Charles, impatient. The king wanted action, not hesitation. "I will accept," Edward said slowly, "but only if it's done the right way. We cannot erase Harry. We cannot humiliate him. If this new role means anything, it must symbolize healing, not replacement." Charles frowned. "You're idealizing what cannot be fixed." The boy made his choice. Edward stood firm. "And so did we, by exiling him in spirit, not just geography. If this is to work, we must rebuild what was broken." The king's hand tightened around his glass. "You think I haven't tried? You think I don't want peace?" Every gesture is met with resentment. Every silence is twisted into cruelty. "The institution is bleeding, Edward." Edward didn't flinch. "Then let's stop the bleeding, not with another cut." It was a rare moment of defiance from the quiet brother, and it left the king speechless. For a long moment, Charles said nothing. Then, finally, he nodded once. "You always were the moral one," he murmured. "Perhaps that's what this family needs." What neither of them realized was that their private exchange wasn't as private as they thought. A conversation that should have remained sealed within Balmoral's stone walls was overheard, or, worse, recorded. And within days, whispers began spreading through the palace network. By the time Charles returned to London, select aides already knew. A replacement plan, a new royal role, a subtle sidelining of Harry's symbolic duties. It wasn't official, not yet, but the story was alive, and someone inside the palace wanted it out. Soon, headlines would explode. Anonymous sources would hint at a shocking new royal appointment. Commentators would speculate. Social media would ignite. But that's the chaos waiting on the horizon. Because right now, at this point in our story, one fact stands alone. King Charles made a proposal that could rewrite royal succession dynamics, and Edward, the quietest Windsor, had just agreed to step into the storm. But before his name could be announced, before the palace could control the narrative, something unthinkable happened. A betrayal from within the walls of Buckingham itself. And when the truth leaked, the monarchy's carefully constructed silence shattered overnight. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It started with a single line in a British tabloid headline. Harry replaced? No one knew where it came from. No official palace source had confirmed it, and yet, by dawn, the story was everywhere. A royal replacement plan. An emergency reshuffle allegedly proposed by King Charles himself. The article didn't name Prince Edward outright, not yet, but it didn't need to. The insinuation was enough to light a fuse under the monarchy's already fragile image. Across London, royal correspondents scrambled. News anchors framed it as a betrayal hiding behind tradition. Within hours, social media erupted into chaos. Hashtags like #RoyalReplacement and #NotMyPrince trended globally. People demanded answers. Who had leaked it? And more importantly, was it true? Inside Buckingham Palace, the mood turned electric. Aides ran through corridors with sealed envelopes, whispered into phones, and exchanged glances that said everything words couldn't. The king was furious, not because the story was false, but because it was half true. Someone had taken his private discussion with Edward and twisted it into a narrative of exile and humiliation for Harry. That morning, an emergency meeting was called in the king's private chambers. Camilla, composed as always, sat quietly beside him. Edward joined by invitation, though the tension in the room made it feel more like an interrogation. Charles slammed the newspaper onto the table. "It's out," he muttered, his voice sharp. "Our private conversation, word for word in the press." Edward studied the headline, a wave of guilt hitting him. "I haven't spoken to anyone," he said firmly. "Not Sophie, not aides, no one." Camilla's eyes flickered. "Then who did?" she asked coolly. That was the question echoing through every royal corridor. Who leaked it? Royal communications teams had long dealt with leaks, but this one felt different. It wasn't just timing. It was precision. Every line in that article matched the private Balmoral discussion almost verbatim. which meant the leak didn't come from the outside. It came from within. One advisor leaned in, voice low. Majesty, we suspect someone close to the household staff, possibly attached to Clarence House. Charles's jaw tightened. Clarence House, his former residence, was still staffed by some of his longest-serving employees. If one of them had betrayed him, this wasn't just gossip. It was sabotage. Meanwhile, the press wasn't waiting for answers. They filled the silence with speculation. Some framed Edward as a loyal knight stepping up in crisis. Others painted him as a quiet usurper, the man willing to replace the king's own son. The narrative was spinning faster than the palace could catch it. And across the ocean in California, Prince Harry woke up to the news with a look of disbelief that quickly turned to rage. He read the headline again, phone in hand. Replaced, he muttered under his breath, eyes narrowing. Meghan, sitting beside him, read over his shoulder. They wouldn't dare, she said sharply. But deep down, they both knew. The palace would absolutely dare. Because this was how the institution survived, by cutting out what no longer served its image. Harry's call to London came within the hour. But when he demanded to speak with his father, aides claimed the king was unavailable. The message was clear, the old hierarchy still ruled. And Harry was no longer part of it. Back in London, chaos turned to crisis management. The palace issued a vague statement. His Majesty maintains great confidence in all members of the royal family as they continue to serve the nation faithfully. Translation? Denial without denial. Classic royal damage control. But behind the scenes, the king was unraveling. To him, the leak wasn't just a PR disaster. It was a personal betrayal. Someone inside my own house is feeding them, he said through clenched teeth. They want to humiliate us before the announcement. Edward remained silent, but he could feel the suspicion in the room slowly tilting toward him. His sudden rise, his private meeting, the timing of it all. Even without proof, whispers had already begun. Maybe Edward leaked it himself. That hurt, deeply. Because Edward's entire life had been built on discretion. If there was one thing he understood better than any of his siblings, it was restraint. And now, his integrity was being shredded before the country's eyes. But while the family turned inward, the outside world was spinning its own story. Some outlets claimed this was a power play by Camilla, that she was orchestrating a soft succession plan through Edward to keep the monarchy controlled and balanced. Others argued that it was Charles's desperate attempt to restore a functional royal image after Harry's destruction of trust. Whatever the truth, the timing couldn't have been worse. Parliament was in session. Polls showed public confidence in the monarchy dipping to its lowest point in a decade. And now, this scandal threatened to plunge the institution into open ridicule. The palace moved quickly to trace the source. Forensic IT teams combed through emails, call logs, and internal communications. What they found shocked even the most seasoned investigators. A digital trail leading not to Clarence House, but to a freelance communications consultant once employed by a senior royal aide. That aide, a quiet but loyal supporter of Harry and Meghan during their royal years. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. The mole wasn't a servant. It was a sympathizer. Someone had leaked the Balmoral discussion out of what they called moral duty, to protect Harry's image from being erased by palace rebranding. The irony? In trying to protect him, they'd set off the biggest royal firestorm since Megxit. By evening, the news cycle was a feeding frenzy. The story had grown teeth. Edward replacing Harry was now the global headline. Cameras camped outside Windsor. Reporters swarmed Balmoral. Even late-night shows in America mocked the absurdity of the situation. The royals are replacing sons like it's the Crown casting auditions. Inside the palace, the mood turned dark. Charles, pacing the room, muttered to Camilla, "This is what happens when loyalty turns into sentiment. No one keeps their silence anymore." Camilla replied, "Then we must control the narrative before it controls you." And that's when everything shifted. Camilla made a bold suggestion. Go public, on their own terms. Announce Edward's new role, she said. Frame it as unity, not replacement. Make it about service and stability, not betrayal. Beat the press to the punch. Charles hesitated. The instinct for privacy clashed with the necessity of control. If we go public now, we validate the rumor, he said. Camilla countered. If we don't, the rumor becomes truth. She was right, and they both knew it. But before Charles could act, Edward made a surprising move of his own. He requested an audience, not to defend himself, but to make one simple plea. "Do not make me a symbol of exile," he said. "If this announcement happens, it must honor family, not erase it." That moment defined him. While everyone else fought over optics, Edward was fighting for principle. And for the first time in years, Charles saw something in his younger brother that he hadn't in anyone else: courage without ambition. Still, the damage was done. The leak had fractured trust within the household. Aides eyed each other with suspicion. William grew tense, watching from the sidelines as his father's decisions blurred the line between fairness and favoritism. And Harry? Harry went quiet, publicly at least. But those close to him said he was preparing a response. A very public one. The palace prepared its counter-strategy. A carefully crafted statement would soon redefine the story, painting Edward not as Harry's replacement, but as a supporting pillar to ensure continuity during the king's period of transition. It was elegant, diplomatic, deceptive, but none of that mattered now. The story was already out of control, and what followed next would shake the monarchy to its core. Because the leak was only the beginning. Someone inside the royal circle wasn't done talking. They had more to reveal, and their next leak, the one waiting just around the corner, would expose something even the king couldn't contain. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Every great scandal has a point of no return, a moment when whispers turn into proof and silence turns into chaos. For King Charles, that moment came 3 days after the first leak. A second story hit the front pages. This time, it wasn't speculation. It was evidence. Someone had leaked the internal briefing notes, the king's own documents, outlining the new role he had offered Edward. The papers bore the royal insignia, time-stamps, and handwritten annotations. It was undeniable. The headline blared across the nation. Secret palace plan. King offers Edward role to replace Harry as royal stabilizer. The monarchy's walls had officially cracked. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere turned suffocating. Phones rang nonstop. The media office was buried under press requests. Advisors whispered in hallways, some in disbelief, others in barely contained panic. For the first time since the Queen's passing, the royal household felt leaderless, like the calm facade had been ripped away to reveal a family at war with itself. Charles locked himself in his private study, the documents spread before him. The handwriting was unmistakably his, the underlined words, the margin notes, continuity, trust, image recovery, all now splashed across the tabloids. He looked up, eyes burning with fury. Who has done this? No one answered. Because no one knew, or at least, no one was willing to say. Edward, meanwhile, was thousands of miles away in Northern Ireland, representing the crown at a charity event. He stood at the podium, cameras flashing, smiles all around. Yet every journalist's question circled the same thing. "Sir, have you been chosen to replace Prince Harry? Do you believe your appointment undermines the king's relationship with his son? Did you request this role yourself?" Edward kept his composure. He smiled politely and said, "I serve at the king's pleasure, as I always have." But inside, he was furious. Furious not at the media, but at the betrayal festering inside his own family's walls. By evening, footage of Edward's stoic response was playing across television screens worldwide. Royal commentators began painting him as the loyal soldier, a man of duty and grace, standing firm amid royal upheaval. But not everyone saw it that way. In Montecito, Harry watched the coverage in silence, his jaw tight. Meghan scrolled through her phone, reading the latest online reactions. One commentator called Edward the anti-Harry. Another said, "The king has finally found his replacement son." Meghan put down her phone. "You see," she said quietly, "they'll always find someone else." Harry didn't answer, but inside, something broke. The words replacement son echoed through his head like a cruel taunt. He'd spent years carving his own path, demanding independence, and now, it seemed, the monarchy was proving it didn't need him at all. Back in London, the search for the leak intensified. Forensic analysts traced the metadata of the document's photographs and discovered something chilling. The images hadn't come from outside hackers or foreign media. They were taken from within the palace network itself, uploaded using an encrypted personal email belonging to a high-ranking royal aide. When the investigators confronted the aide, she broke down in tears. "I didn't mean for this to go this far," she said. "I thought it would stop them from rewriting history." She confessed that she had been in contact with a former royal press secretary, one who had quietly aligned himself with Harry and Meghan's media team after their departure. He had promised to correct the narrative before the monarchy erased Harry from public memory. And there it was, the confirmation everyone feared. The leak wasn't political. It was personal. The king's private plans had been sabotaged from within his own institution, all in the name of loyalty to a son who had left it behind. When Charles learned the truth, he didn't speak for a long time. He stood at the window, staring out over the palace gardens, and whispered, "My family has become its own enemy." Camilla entered quietly. "What will you do?" His answer came slowly. "What I must, even if it costs me more than I can bear." That night, a palace statement was drafted, not by his PR team, but by the king himself. It read, "The stability of the crown depends on service above self. Every member of this family must remember where their duty lies, not in rivalry, but in responsibility." To the public, it sounded like a message of unity. But to those inside the palace, it was a warning, a royal declaration of war, and the first casualty was inevitable. By morning, the aide responsible for the leak was quietly dismissed. Her name was kept out of the papers, but word spread fast among staff. The atmosphere inside the palace turned icy. Everyone was watching everyone. Every email double-checked, every conversation second-guessed. The walls that had once symbolized royal strength now echoed with paranoia. Meanwhile, Edward faced a new problem: public sympathy. The press began portraying him as the reluctant savior. Articles called him the brother who never wanted power but was given it anyway. That kind of narrative might sound flattering, but in royal circles, it's dangerous. William grew uneasy. Courtiers whispered that Edward's popularity was unintentional but inconvenient. And for Charles, who had spent decades balancing the egos of his sons, the idea of a new power dynamic emerging between his brothers felt like history repeating itself. But amid the swirl of headlines and speculation, one man stayed silent: Edward himself. He refused interviews. He avoided press conferences. He stayed dignified, even when the world begged him to speak. Until one fateful evening, when he attended a private royal engagement in London. The event was small, a dinner for Commonwealth representatives. Cameras were limited, but one journalist managed to capture a brief exchange between Edward and a senior diplomat. The diplomat, unaware of the microphone still recording nearby, asked casually, "Sir, how does it feel stepping into Prince Harry's shoes?" Edward smiled faintly, then replied, "I don't step into anyone's shoes. I simply walk the path my mother taught me, quietly." That single line went viral. In one sentence, Edward had defused the tension and redefined the narrative. He wasn't replacing Harry. He was restoring something older, something the late Queen had embodied: duty without drama. The public loved it. Commentators praised his composure. Polls showed a sudden rise in approval for both Edward and Sophie. Inside the palace, Charles felt a flicker of relief. For the first time in months, the monarchy looked calm again, steady, respectable, unified. But the calm was a lie, because behind the scenes, the consequences of the leaks were still unfolding. Harry was preparing his counterattack, and this time, he wasn't relying on journalists. He was preparing to speak directly to the world. In California, a source close to the Sussexes confirmed it. A new documentary segment was being filmed, one that would expose what Harry called the final betrayal by my own blood. Charles's attempt to strengthen the monarchy had backfired spectacularly. Instead of unity, he'd reignited the very storm he'd tried to end. And as the cameras rolled in Montecito, Harry looked straight into the lens and said, "They can replace my name. They can replace my role, but they will never replace the truth." That clip, just 6 seconds long, would soon ignite a transatlantic firestorm. But before it aired, something even more shocking happened. An internal royal message leaked once more, revealing that King Charles had taken a drastic step behind closed doors. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The message was short, cold, and devastating. It was sent from the private royal communications server under the subject line: Directive, Role Reassignment Confirmation. Only a handful of senior royals and advisors received it. But as always in the palace, secrets are temporary, and silence is a luxury no one can afford. King Charles had made his decision. Effective immediately, Prince Edward was to assume new, expanded duties in support of the crown, including special representation of the king during state matters and foreign affairs, duties that, before Megxit, had been held by Prince Harry himself. In essence, Edward was no longer just a working royal. He was the king's shadow, the man stepping into the void Harry had left behind. It was official. Harry had been replaced. The memo leaked within hours. The wording alone was enough to send shockwaves through the global media. Expanded duties. In support of the crown. Royal representation abroad. To the press, it was confirmation of what had been whispered for weeks. King Charles had chosen his brother over his son. The next morning, the headlines were brutal. Charles cuts Harry out, Edward in. New prince, old loyalty. Windsor strategy exposed. A royal divide now made official. Outside Buckingham Palace, the crowds gathered, some cheering Edward's appointment, others holding signs with Harry's face. One banner read, "You can't replace blood." Another countered, "You can't betray duty." The monarchy had become a battleground. Loyalty versus legacy. Father versus son. Tradition versus truth. Inside the palace walls, Charles was unyielding. "We must move forward," he told his advisors. "This is not about punishment. It is about preservation." But even as he said it, his hands trembled. He knew what he had done. He had made the most controversial decision of his reign, and there was no going back. Prince William, who had remained quiet until now, requested an urgent meeting. When he entered the king's study, his expression was tight, unreadable. "You've created a storm you can't control," he said calmly. "Harry will never forgive this." Charles didn't look up. "I am not seeking forgiveness," he replied. "I am seeking stability." William stepped closer. "And what happens when this backfires? When Edward becomes the face of your decision, not you? The people will see this as favoritism, or worse, desperation." There it was, the heir warning the monarch. A rare reversal of power. But Charles didn't back down. "I am the king," he said, "and my duty is to the crown, not to my son's wounded pride." That line would soon haunt him. Because within 24 hours, Harry's documentary teaser dropped, and the royal narrative was obliterated. It opened with an image of the late queen, smiling, waving, the perfect symbol of unity. Then came Harry's voice, quiet but cutting. "I was raised to believe that duty meant loyalty to the family. But what happens when that family decides you're disposable?" The screen faded to black. Then the words appeared in stark white letters. The replacement. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't accidental. It was Harry's answer to the king's proposal, broadcast to millions. Within hours, the trailer was trending across social media. The public reaction was explosive. Some sided with Harry, accusing Charles of cruelty, of trying to rewrite the royal lineage. Others defended the king, calling Harry's words manipulative and self-serving. But one thing was certain, the wound had reopened. Reporters began camped outside every royal residence. Every expression, every statement, every silence became headline fuel. Camilla canceled appearances. William retreated with his family to Amer Hall. And Edward, the man at the center of it all, tried to continue his duties with quiet dignity, even as cameras followed his every move. In private, Edward was tormented. He never wanted this to become a spectacle. He had accepted the king's proposal out of duty, not ambition. But now, he was being painted as an opportunist, the replacement prince, the man who'd stepped over his nephew's reputation for power. One night, he sat with Sophie in their Windsor home, hands clasped tightly. "This isn't what I agreed to," he said softly. "This isn't unity, it's carnage." Sophie looked at him, her tone steady but firm. "Then you must make them see who you really are. Not through words, through actions. Show them what loyalty looks like." That advice would soon define the rest of Edward's royal life. Because in the days that followed, he made a choice that shocked even the palace. He refused to attend an upcoming royal gala in London, the first major event since his appointment. Instead, he visited a children's hospice quietly, without media, without press releases, without fanfare. The photos, taken by local volunteers, went viral for all the right reasons. No entourage, no cameras, just Edward, sitting cross-legged on the floor, reading to a terminally ill child. The public saw something raw and real, a royal who served, not one who posed. And in that moment, Edward's reputation shifted. He wasn't the usurper anymore. He was the reluctant savior. Meanwhile, Charles was preparing for his next move. He'd planned a televised address to calm the chaos, to clarify the meaning of Edward's role. The goal was simple: frame the move as a strategic delegation of duties, not a symbolic replacement. But just as the palace finalized the broadcast schedule, another internal memo surfaced, this one far more explosive. It revealed that Charles had privately discussed granting Edward a new ceremonial title to reflect his evolving responsibilities. A title that once belonged to Harry himself, Captain General of the Royal Marines. It was the final straw. The Marines Veterans Associations went public with outrage. Prince Harry earned that title through active service. One statement read, "To hand it to another royal without combat history is an insult to every soldier who served beside him." The backlash was instant and fierce. Charles had underestimated how deeply symbolic that role was, not just to the military, but to the public who still saw Harry as the soldier prince. Suddenly, Edward was thrust into an impossible position. If he accepted the title, he'd confirm the replacement narrative. If he refused, he'd defy the king. For days, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he made his decision. At a closed royal luncheon, Edward stood, raised his glass, and said to the king, "Your Majesty, I am honored by your confidence. But some duties are better left untouched, for the sake of peace." A silence fell across the room. Charles stared at him for a long moment, then nodded, once, with quiet understanding. Edward had declined the title, but in doing so, he had done something far greater. He'd drawn a line between service and ambition. The headlines the next morning were unexpected. Prince Edward refuses title, calls for unity. A royal who remembers his duty. Public opinion swung sharply in his favor. Even former critics applauded his humility. For once, the monarchy wasn't bleeding scandal. It was healing, if only for a moment. But behind the applause, something deeper was happening. Charles began to see Edward differently, not as a stand-in, but as a mirror, a reflection of the kind of royal he had always wanted to be: steady, loyal, free from ego. And that realization led the king to a decision that would shock his entire family. Because if Edward had proven his loyalty through restraint, then perhaps, just perhaps, he was worthy of something even greater. A responsibility not of replacement, but of regency. And when that idea surfaced behind closed doors, it would send a ripple of fear through the House of Windsor. Because if Prince Edward became regent, acting king in all but name, then Harry wouldn't just be replaced. He would be erased. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It began, as all royal earthquakes do, with a whisper. A whisper that spread from one polished corridor to another, until it reached the very heart of the monarchy itself. The king is considering a regency. At first, it sounded absurd. King Charles, despite his age and occasional health concerns, was still very much on the throne, still performing engagements, still addressing the nation. Yet the whisper persisted. Something was shifting behind closed doors. And the one name being spoken in hushed tones around Buckingham Palace wasn't William's, it was Edward's. For the first time in centuries, the prospect of a royal regency was being discussed not as a constitutional necessity, but as a strategic safeguard. According to those briefed on the matter, Charles had privately told his inner circle, "The crown must not falter, no matter my condition." He wanted someone to act in his stead during periods of absence or illness, a stabilizer who could project continuity and calm. William, of course, was the natural successor. But the king's reasoning was different. He didn't want an heir in waiting. He wanted a guardian in action. And to the king, there was only one man who fit that role: Prince Edward. At first, even Edward couldn't believe it. He received the call from the king's private secretary one rainy morning. "His Majesty requests your counsel," the voice said. "It's a delicate matter." Edward assumed it was about the fallout from the Royal Marines controversy. He didn't expect to hear the words that followed. "The king wishes to explore a regency framework. Your name has been put forward as acting regent in the event of incapacity." Edward froze. "Regent," he repeated, almost disbelieving. "You mean, temporarily acting as monarch?" "Yes, sir," the voice replied. "That would be the constitutional mechanism." Edward set the phone down, staring into the distance. His heart pounded. This wasn't just an expanded role or a symbolic gesture. This was something far greater and far more dangerous. To the public, a regency would look like a quiet succession. And in the fragile ecosystem of royal politics, that could ignite a war. When he arrived at Clarence's house that evening, Charles was waiting. The king looked older, paler, more tired than Edward had ever seen him. The two brothers sat opposite one another by the fireplace. The air was thick with unspoken truths. Charles didn't waste time. "I won't live forever, Edward," he said. "And I won't leave this institution unprepared again." Edward's brow furrowed. "You have William." "Yes," Charles said, his voice low. "But William has his own burdens. The transition must be gradual, not abrupt. The people must not feel instability. Not again, not after everything. You understand that better than anyone." It was both flattery and burden. Edward knew what the king was asking. Not just to act as regent if required, but to be the glue that held the monarchy together in its most fragile moments. A bridge between an aging king and an heir not yet ready to bear the full weight of the crown's loneliness. But Edward also knew what this would mean for the family, and for Harry. "You're asking me to replace him twice over," Edward said quietly. "First as your representative, now as your stand-in. How can the public ever see that as unity?" Charles sighed, rubbing his temples. "They will see what we tell them to see. We frame it as stewardship, not succession. As duty, not replacement. You've earned that trust. You are the least controversial figure in this family. Edward, that's your greatest strength." Edward leaned forward. "And what happens when Harry sees this? When William sees this? You know what it looks like. You're setting me up as a second monarch." For the first time, Charles looked genuinely shaken. "You think I don't know the cost? You think I want this? I am doing what must be done to protect what remains of this family's honor. If we do nothing, the monarchy will die by hesitation." That word, hesitation, lingered in the air like a curse. Edward had always been the cautious one, the careful one, the invisible one. But now, Charles was asking him to become something else entirely, a leader. The meeting ended with no resolution. The idea of a regency remained unspoken yet alive, a quiet, ticking possibility. But rumors have a way of outrunning decisions. Within a week, palace staff began noticing subtle shifts. Senior advisors from the Privy Council were making unannounced visits. Lawyers from the Lord Chancellor's office were seen entering Clarence's house after midnight. Even parliamentary aides whispered about briefings regarding constitutional continuity. Something was happening, something real. And as always, it didn't stay secret for long. The press got wind of it from an unexpected source, a parliamentary clerk who'd overheard a conversation between two senior ministers. The next morning, the Times ran with the headline, "King in discussions for regency plan. Prince Edward tipped as choice." It was chaos all over again. Reporters camped outside Windsor. Television anchors debated whether Charles was too ill to reign. Online commentators dissected every public appearance, every cough, every pause in his speeches. And Harry? Harry exploded. In California, he phoned his father directly. The call, according to insiders, lasted only 6 minutes. "You've replaced me once," Harry allegedly said, voice shaking. "Now you're replacing your heir, too. What's left, Dad? Who are you actually protecting, your family or your throne?" Charles, weary and cornered, said only this, "I'm protecting both. You do well to remember which one comes first." The call ended in silence. Soon after, a palace insider leaked one more detail. The regency discussions had included not only legal advisors, but also the Archbishop of Canterbury. The church's involvement meant one thing: the king was serious. Edward, however, was anything but eager. Behind closed doors, he begged Charles to reconsider. "You don't need me for this," he said. "Let William take the lead. The monarchy cannot look like it's bypassing its own bloodline." Charles replied softly, "This is not about lineage. It's about loyalty." And that line changed everything. Because while the king's intent was preservation, the optics were devastation. The monarchy was being reshaped into a reflection of one man's trust, not the people's tradition. William grew cold toward both of them. Harry's anger turned into open defiance. And Edward? He became trapped in the middle, the unwilling symbol of a monarchy trying to outlive its own mistakes. As the debate raged in public, a new poll sent shockwaves through the palace. More than 60% of Britons said they would support Edward acting as regent if the king became unable to serve. His quiet demeanor, his humility, his apparent lack of ambition, all of it worked in his favor. The nation loved the man who didn't want the crown. But inside those palace walls, admiration turned to resentment. The heir felt overshadowed. The exiled prince felt erased. And the king felt isolated. The House of Windsor, for all its centuries of ceremony, was once again descending into chaos. This time, not over scandal or romance, but over succession itself. Then, just as the debate reached fever pitch, something happened that changed the tone of everything. A new photograph appeared on the palace's official social media. A simple image, King Charles standing beside Edward, both smiling, both holding a framed portrait of the late Queen Elizabeth II. No caption, no statement, just that image. But the symbolism was unmistakable. The Queen's legacy, the King's faith, the brothers' loyalty. It was a declaration without words that the monarchy was united, at least on the surface. For a brief moment, the world exhaled. But deep inside the palace, those closest to the king knew that image was a bandage, not a cure. The discussions of regency were not over. They had merely gone quiet, for now. And beneath that calm, another revelation was waiting. Because the next person to discover what Charles had truly been planning wasn't William, and it wasn't Camilla. It was Princess Anne. And when she uncovered the full scope of her brother's proposal, her reaction would send shockwaves through the royal household and expose the secret clause in the regency plan that no one, not even Edward, knew existed. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It was early morning at Buckingham Palace, the kind of gray London dawn where the world feels half asleep, and had come in unannounced, as she often did, to review schedules for an upcoming Commonwealth tour. She didn't expect to find a stack of folders on her brother's desk, left open after a late-night meeting. At first, it looked like routine paperwork, briefings, event plans, drafts of speeches. But then one document caught her eye. It was stamped, private, royal confidential, and titled Continuity Protocol, Regent Appointment Contingencies. Her eyes narrowed. Regent? She started reading. The language was clinical, precise, the kind of bureaucratic coldness that hid human consequences. It outlined procedures to be enacted in the event of temporary incapacity of the sovereign, naming a primary and secondary acting regent. The primary, Prince Edward, Duke of Edinburgh, and froze. She read the next paragraph twice, hardly believing it. The secondary, the fallback option, wasn't William. It wasn't Camilla. It wasn't even her. It was someone the memo called the Reserve. And beneath that cryptic title was a single initial, A. Her heart skipped. A. There were only a handful of senior royals with names starting with that letter. But none made sense, until the realization hit her like a punch. It wasn't a name. It was a code. At the bottom of the page, in smaller print, was the full identifier. Project Aegis, classified succession safeguard to ensure crown preservation in non-public scenarios. Anne's pulse quickened. She'd heard whispers of Project Aegis before, a rumored contingency discussed during the late Queen's final years, meant to protect the monarchy from internal crisis. But she'd always dismissed it as court gossip. Now she was staring at proof. And buried within the next few paragraphs was something even more explosive. If enacted, the regency wouldn't just grant Edward temporary authority. It would allow him to restructure official royal duties, including redefining which members were active representatives of the crown. In other words, Edward would have the power to permanently remove or restore any family member's official status, even without the monarch's explicit approval, if the king was deemed indisposed. And felt her stomach tighten. This wasn't a regency. It was a silent coup. She flipped through the remaining pages, lists of advisors, proposed statements, communication strategies in case of public controversy. Every line screamed control, secrecy, manipulation. And then she found a note handwritten in Charles's own looping script. Edward must be prepared to act decisively. Sentiment is weakness. And to be informed after confirmation only. Her breath caught. After confirmation only. Her own brother, keeping her in the dark about a plan that could alter the very structure of the monarchy. That morning, Anne marched straight to Clarence's house. The king's private secretary tried to stop her, mumbling something about appointments and timing. She brushed past him. When Charles saw her enter, he looked up wearily. "And," he said, "this isn't the time." She slapped the file onto his desk. "Then make time." The room went still. "I found this," she said, voice steady but sharp. "You're creating a regency in secret. And worse, you've tied Edward's hands to powers that even you don't have the right to grant." "What is Project Aegis, Charles? What are you doing?" Charles leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You weren't supposed to see that yet." "I can see why," she replied. "You're preparing to crown Edward while you're still alive." "That's not what this is," Charles said quickly. "It's about continuity. You of all people should understand that." Anne's eyes flashed. "Continuity doesn't mean deceit. Do you realize what happens if this leaks? The monarchy survives on trust, and you're tearing that to shreds." Charles stood, his tone low and brittle. "Do not lecture me on duty, Anne. I have carried the weight of this crown through crisis after crisis, scandals, resignations, betrayals. I cannot risk another collapse. Edward is the only one I can rely on to hold it together. Then tell the public the truth." And snapped. "If he's your regent, announce it properly. Stop hiding behind codes and secrecy. Because if you don't, someone else will." For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Two siblings, both born into duty, both prisoners of it. Finally, Charles said, "You think I don't know what's coming? The moment this becomes public, William will see it as an insult, and Harry will see it as proof of conspiracy. The press will call it succession by stealth. I cannot risk that storm. Not yet." Anne's voice softened, but her eyes didn't. "You've already risked something worse. Their faith." She turned and left without another word. But as she walked out, Charles called after her quietly, almost pleadingly, "I did this for the family." And paused at the door. "No, Charles," she said. "You did it for control." That night, and made a decision. She couldn't let the monarchy stumble into another hidden disaster. But she also couldn't betray her brother outright. So she did the one thing she knew how to do. She acted. The next day, she requested a private lunch with Edward at Bagshot Park. When he arrived, she wasted no time. "I need to show you something," she said, handing him the document. As Edward read, the color drained from his face. He set the pages down slowly. "He didn't tell me any of this," he whispered. "I figured as much," and said, "Charles is giving you authority that could destroy you. The moment this becomes public, they'll turn on you. William, the press, everyone. You'll be seen as the man who tried to take the throne before it was time." Edward's hands trembled slightly. "I would never." "I know that," and interrupted. "But perception doesn't care about intention. This plan makes you look like the usurper. You need to protect yourself, and him, before it's too late." For a while, Edward said nothing. The weight of what he'd read hung in the air. He looked up finally, eyes full of conflict. "He trusts me," he said, and nodded. "And that trust could ruin you." By evening, Edward sat alone in his study, the document spread before him. Outside, the rain lashed against the windows. He thought about his brother, the burden of the crown, the loneliness of command. He thought about Harry, William, and the fractures between them. And he thought about what would happen if this plan went public before it was ready. He knew what he had to do. That night, Edward wrote a letter, a private message to the king himself. He didn't accuse, didn't condemn. He simply said one thing. "If unity is our goal, secrecy cannot be our method. I will not serve as regent under conditions that divide the family further. I will serve only in truth." The letter was hand-delivered to Clarence House before dawn. When Charles read it, he said nothing. He just folded the page, slipped it into his jacket, and looked out toward the morning fog. And though no one knew it yet, that letter would trigger the next chapter in the royal saga, a chapter that would expose the monarchy's deepest fracture, the moment when loyalty to the crown collided with loyalty to family. Because the next move wasn't Charles's to make. It was William's. And when he found out about Project Aegis, his response would be nothing short of explosive. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. William learned about Project Aegis the same way the world learns about royal secrets, through a leak that should never have happened. It was a Thursday morning, calm and ordinary, until a single phrase began trending on social media, #Project Aegis. At first, it seemed like another conspiracy theory, a fabricated royal code name dredged up by gossip blogs. But within hours, major outlets began publishing. The Daily Telegraph broke the story wide open. Sources close to the palace confirm existence of confidential regency contingency known as Project Aegis, placing Prince Edward as acting regent under undisclosed terms. It was out, every detail, and had warned about. Every clause Charles had kept hidden. And William, who had been blindsided yet again, was furious. When he saw the headline, he didn't call his father. He didn't call Edward. He called Anne. Is it true? His voice was sharp, almost shaking, and sighed. Yes, but it wasn't supposed to be public. He was silent for a moment. Then, he made Edward regent? Not yet, she replied carefully. It was a contingency plan, something to ensure stability if the king became incapacitated.